Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first online lecture for the rest of the online spring semester. So, today we're going to discuss postcolonial theory and ethnic studies. And today's main theme is the drama of politics and ethnicity. So, like other theories, there's a lot of overlap. I would argue that postcolonialism is the most interdisciplinary of the fields, and you'll probably see why as we move on, but basically it draws from everything and impacts every sort of field of study from science to anthropology to psychology to social work, all sorts of things, right? So, what does it do? It examines the global impact of European colonialism from its beginnings in the 15th century to the present. So, here are the focal points, of course, beyond that overarching idea. The politics of knowledge. So, how is knowledge created? How is knowledge controlled? And how is knowledge distributed? This is kind of an important aspect for all our educators in the class because how do we determine which works are going to be studied, right? Who controls that, right? Who controls knowledge? What subjects do we teach? What artists do we teach? And so forth. This is an important aspect when it comes to all sorts of fields, right? Because who controls the knowledge, right? And think of history class, right? There's a lot of important aspects, especially going on with a lot of the textbooks that are coming out of Texas, right? Where, you know, do you teach Jefferson, right? Do you teach him as a slave owner and so forth? How do you portray the founding fathers, right? And all sorts of ideas that are very important to the control, of course, knowledge. Going along the lines, right, the relations between social and political power, right? Who controls the social and political power within a nation, world, and so forth? How does the colonial power represent the colonizer and the colonized? And that's, of course, an important aspect as well, right? Who controls representation? And think of today, right? When we get to film, right? That's a crucial point. Look at, all the discussions with Black Panther and all the ideas of ethnic representation in film, sex representation in film, orientation and gender representation in film, right? All these stem from kind of post-colonial ideas and theories. This chart here is kind of a helpful one to show how colonialism affects these three different realms, right? So as a person, if you're a colonized person, right, you typically feel a dehumanization of self, right? The inability to support or protect yourself, self-doubt. Think of after colonialism, a minority, right? So if you're a person of a minority in a specific country, how are you at a loss, right? Do you have to navigate and focus and navigate and again that agency, right? How do you move freely throughout a society and culture? Also, too, your values are going to shift. Your original ethnic values will shift. There's typically going to be a loss of identity, challenges to faith, language, and politics. This is, of course, always important for first generation immigrants, right? So do you do you learn the language, right, of your parents? Do you learn the language of your grandparents, right? What's going to happen with that identity, cultural identity? Do you celebrate the cultural norms? Whose cultural norms do you follow? All these things are important, right, for studying the effects of colonialism. And then, of course, the us versus other mentality, right? There's always going to be, again, think of majority versus minority and so forth. There's always a distorted worldview. Typically, everyone's going to be racist, right? And in terms of high-powered colonialism, so it's an important aspect to kind of think of how ideology is constructed. And so, what post-colonial critics explore is how the European Western world, right, ideologically justified its self-ascribed superiority, racial and cultural, over non-Western cultures. And this is an important aspect because a lot of other empires previously did not colonize and conquer in the same way as the Europeans did, right, starting with the 14th century, or excuse me, 15th century. So again, there's not usually a loss of the tribal language, right? Roman Empire, for example, let you keep your language. They let you keep your religion. European colonization is much more, and this is where we get white supremacy, European supremacy, right? So I pulled this one from 1871 because this is an important aspect to look at in terms of even as European countries were still colonizing, after, of course, European countries in America abandoned slavery, there's still a form of supremacy in place. And so this is from Joseph Ernest Renan, and this is La Forme intellectuelle et morale. The regeneration of the inferior or degenerate races by the superior races is part of the providential order of things for humanity. Regere imperial populace, to rule mankind is our vocation. Now, again, I picked this because for 400 years, basically now, right, what you are getting is this idea that God, right, has made white people better and non-whites terrible, right? And you see that philosophy over and over again. To go back to your history classes, the way people justified slavery, the way people justify racism and so forth, right, even justify ethnic conflict is a lot of times through, in the Western world, these kind of ideologies. This also goes back to British literature, the great chain of being, divine right of kings, right? That God has given certain people power over others. So it just gets worse. Pour forth this all consuming activity onto countries which, like China, are crying aloud for foreign conquest. Turn the adventurers who disturb European society into a ver sacrum, sacred spring, a horde like those of the Franks, the Lombards, and the Normans, and every man will be in his right role. Nature has made a race of workers, the Chinese race, who have wonderful manual dexterity and almost no sense of honor. Govern them with justice, levying from them in return for the blessing of such a government an ample allowance for the conquering race, and they will be satisfied. Notice again just the dripping of supremacy, right? There's ethnic conflict established already, but then we also look at the idea of the natural order of things, right? That, again, just horribly racist sentiment, but a dominating one at the time. And of course, still we have to fight off white supremacy even today. And this is why you're talking about 400 years at this point. We're now almost basically 600 years of repeating this philosophy. And so this is why postcolonial studies exist, right? To look at how we can get rid of this kind of supremacy, right? To get rid of these kind of ideas, and then two, just to kind of conclude, right? So and they will be satisfied, a race of tillers of the soil, the Negro, treat him with kindness and humanity, and all will be as it should, a race of masters and soldiers. Crucial line that's always quoted from white supremacists today. The European race, let each do what he is made for, and all will be well, right? So again, this is what's problematic, right, about the effects of colonialism. They say that it's for a good reason, right? It's natural. We're bringing them God. We're bringing them morals. We're bringing them intellectual. We're bringing them religion, right? But of course, as post-colonialists study, that's not the case. So what are we looking at? Well, an important kind of phrase is imperial stewardship. So this idea is basically how Europeans felt, right? That the intellectual and moral reformation of non-white peoples, of the lesser cultures, need to happen, right? So that, again, God, divinely inspired, right? That Europeans need to conquer the world to make the world a better place. Again, the important aspect is divinely established, right? It's natural harmony. That's what colonizers believe, that they are doing what's natural, right? That white people should control the world and so forth. And then everyone had their own place and cultural identity, even, right? That everyone was assigned this, again, to go back to Renan, right? A race of workers, right? That everything is just a natural order. And then once the colonizer takes control, everything will just be harmonious. It will fall into place, right? Without any kind of issue. Another important aspect when you look at the domination of European imperialism, right? So here are all the current nations that were once conquered by, of course, Europe or colonized by Europe. So huge, right, amount of territories that still are under the philosophical influences, even when they gain independence, right? They still have to deal with the ramifications of colonialism. Notice too, again, even the countries that weren't colonized still under partial control. Some of them are still under the influence. And then, of course, there's few, one, of course, being created for former slaves. So, just a few over here that were never colonized at all. So it's an important aspect to look at the effects of European colonialism even today. So a few pre-works that really anticipate what we call post-colonialist theory. So three works, right, draw attention to the harmful effects. The first one we're going to look at is Vladimir Lenin, so notice the overlap with Marxism. So in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism from 1916, he describes that colonial imperialism is the degenerate form of capitalism, which requires greater degrees of human exploitation to ensure continually consistent profit for investment. Moreover, in the course of colonizing underdeveloped countries, business and government eventually will engage in geopolitical conflict over the economic exploitation of large portions of the geographic world and its populaces. And then, of course, further idea that imperialism is the highest advanced stage of capitalism, requiring monopolies, labor, and natural resource exploitation, and, of course, the exploitation of financial capital. So, no goods. We need capital to sustain colonialism, which is, again, an integral function of that economic mode, right? So, that capitalism will eventually lead to empires and dictatorships. And then those empires and dictatorships, unlike Renan's view that, oh, we're going to make people better because they'll believe in Jesus, no, they will be worse, right? The colonized people will be exploited, destroyed, stripped of their humanity. And so this is what Lenin was attacking when he looks at imperialism. To continue Lenin's ideas, we have Amir Cesaire in the Discourse on Colonialism from 1950. Now, Cesaire expands on Lenin's concepts and creates a couple of major premises. The first one is that colonialism has not and has never been a benevolent movement since the colonizers' goals rarely improve the lives of the colonized. Instead, colonists' motives are entirely self-centered, usually, of course, for economic exploitation. And then there's a great quote that's often referenced: no one colonizes innocently, that no one colonizes with impunity either. That a nation which colonizes, that a civilization which justifies colonization, and therefore force, is already a sick civilization, a civilization which is morally diseased, which is irresistibly progressing from one consequence to another, one denial to another, calls for its Hitler, its punishment. So we see here the attack on people like Renan, and again, those that 400 years of that philosophy that Europeans should conquer and that colonization is better for everyone, right? It's better for the world, right? So what all the academics, of course, once they start studying the effects of colonization, they, of course, are saying, no, there is barely any positives to colonization at all. And then the last work of the kind of pre-works is The Wretched of the Earth, and this is from 1961. So in this work, Franz Fanon analyzes and medically describes the nature of colonialism as essentially destructive. And this work's important because he's an anthropologist as well, and his major career was a psychologist. So here's a psychologist using kind of interdisciplinary studies to look at the mental effects of colonized people. So this is an important quote. Colonial domination manages to disrupt in spectacular fashion the cultural life of a conquered people by creating laws that are harmful to the mental health of the native peoples, and again, focus on psychology. So Fanon argues that violence is a way for the colonizer to control and terrorize the colonized, yet violence is a way for the colonized to be empowered. So he looked at the important mental reasons for violence, right? So colonizers, of course, need to control people, so they're going to use violence. But then freedom can only be achieved through violence, which is a cathartic act for the native peoples and their minds. But yet it can, of course, and he goes on, and especially in the first part that focuses on violence, he goes on to talk about the dangerous psychological effects of violence even after they become free, right? Because a lot of times they as we'll see with other kind of works, that they fight civil wars immediately after freedom and so forth. And so there's all these things that are crucial to understanding the kind of mental effects of colonialism. But again, Fanon starts that discussion.